"Can we bring her home for Christmas, Daddy?" the girl asked, her small hand tugging at her father's coat as they stood in the cold evening light watching the lonely widow sitting on the old bench outside the general store holding two ragdolls close as though they were the last warm things left in her world. The widow's coat was too thin for the winter wind and her breath drifted in soft clouds while she rocked the ragdolls gently as if comforting them, and her eyes carried a kind sadness that made the father pause in his tracks because there was something in her solitude that struck him deep and unexpected. The girl stepped forward, her boots crunching softly in the snow as she looked at the widow with an innocent tenderness that seemed to melt the cold around them, and she whispered again, "Daddy, she looks so alone." The father watched the widow carefully, noticing the way she held the dolls with gentle care as if they were pieces of a past she could not let go, and he felt a tug in his own chest, for Christmas was near and the night carried the hush of a world waiting for warmth, and he could not ignore the quiet ache in the widow's expression. He approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her, and the widow lifted her gaze, her eyes wide with both hope and worry, and the ragdolls pressed close to her chest like fragile memories. "Are you all right?" he asked, and she nodded, though her voice trembled as she answered, "I am just resting a spell, sir, and keeping my little ones warm." The father looked at the ragdolls, realizing she was not pretending they were real but remembering something dear, something lost, and his heartbeat softened in a way he had not expected. "My daughter wondered if you had somewhere warm to go for Christmas," he said, and the widow froze, her fingers tightening around the fabric of the dolls and her eyes flickered with disbelief. "No one has asked me that in a long time," she whispered, and her voice cracked like thin ice under gentle weight. The girl stepped closer, easing herself onto the bench beside the widow, and without hesitating she touched one ragdoll with the soft curiosity of a child who sees no difference between people who have plenty and people who have little, and the widow blinked as if the small gesture struck her heart with warmth she had forgotten existed. "Do they have names?" the girl asked, pointing to the dolls, and the widow nodded, slowly brushing a strand of hair from her cheek as she spoke their names with such affection that the father felt the truth of her loneliness settle heavily in the winter air. The girl smiled and said, "They are pretty names," and the widow gave a small trembling smile that looked like it had been waiting years to be found again. The wind picked up, swirling snow around their feet, and the father saw how the widow shivered despite trying to hide it, and he knew he could not leave her there in the cold, not on any night, and certainly not on a night so close to Christmas when kindness should burn brightest. "We have a warm house," he said, "and a supper waiting, and if you would like to join us you would be welcome," and the widow looked at him as though the offer were a miracle she had never dared hope for. "I do not wish to be a burden," she said, but the girl shook her head fiercely and said, "You would not be a burden, you would be our guest." The widow pressed the ragdolls tighter, her breathing shaky as she tried to accept the idea that someone wanted her not out of pity but out of genuine care, and she finally nodded, her eyes shining with tears she tried to hide. The father extended his hand to help her stand, and she rose slowly, unsteady from the cold, and the girl offered one mittened hand to guide her, and together they walked through the snow toward the small house at the end of the lane where a warm lamplight glowed softly through frosted windows. Inside, the house smelled of pine needles and baking bread, and the widow hesitated at the doorway, overwhelmed by the warmth and color, the garlands, the flickering candles, and the gentle hum of a place filled with quiet joy. "Come in," the girl said, tugging her hand, and the widow stepped inside, holding the ragdolls carefully as if introducing them to a world they had forgotten. The father hung her coat near the stove, and the heat began to thaw the chill clinging to her bones. The widow looked around, absorbing every detail as though she feared it might vanish, and she whispered, "This feels like home," and her voice wavered with gratitude. The girl guided her to the table where extra silverware had already been set as though the house itself had known she was coming, and the father smiled softly at the sight. They sat together, the girl chatting about Christmas ornaments and her favorite songs while the widow listened with a soft smile, her sadness lifting like snow melting under morning sun. When supper was served, the widow bowed her head briefly, whispering a silent thanks, and the father noticed the way she held the ragdolls beside her as if letting them share in the warmth. As the evening deepened, the girl led the widow to the small Christmas tree, asking if she wanted to hang an ornament, and the widow hesitated before gently placing a tiny wooden angel on a branch, her hands trembling at the simple kindness of being included. The girl hugged her, then surprising her completely, and the widow froze before slowly wrapping one arm around the child, tears spilling down her cheeks as the warmth of the moment filled her heart. "Daddy," she whispered to the father, "thank you," and the father nodded, understanding without needing words. As the fire crackled and the night outside grew darker, the widow sat with the girl beside the glowing tree, and the ragdolls rested safely in her lap, no longer symbols of loneliness but keepsakes of a past carried into a kinder present. The father watched them quietly, realizing that sometimes the greatest gifts at Christmas are not wrapped with ribbon but found in moments where a heart opens to another and the cold edges of the world soften. The widow leaned back in the chair, breathing deeply, her eyes drifting toward the girl who now rested against her side, and for the first time in years she felt something like belonging, something like hope. The snow fell softly outside, blanketing the world in white silence, and inside the house filled with gentle laughter, the warmth of shared company and the promise of a brighter Christmas than any of them expected.